Hello, hello. We're going to continue with our lesson of Chapter 8. The next section is going to be what's known as the Harlem Renaissance. So it says during the Harlem Renaissance, you need to notice that it says African American artists, writers, and musicians who were based in the Harlem district of New York City revealed the freshness and variety of African American culture. Remember, previously to this, and even during this, a lot of your African American people were being discriminated against, even 60 plus years after the Civil War. And we've talked about why that is and how that looked. And finally, the Harlem Renaissance came about and it showcased the African American culture. And we're going to really look and dive into some of the ways that the African Americans were finally, given some of the credit that they deserved during this time. So it says, who were some of the artists who led the Harlem Renaissance and whose popularity spread beyond Harlem to the rest of society? Well, first of all, we need to look at this word right here, Renaissance. When we talk about a Renaissance, a lot of times we talk about like a Renaissance fair, the Renaissance time during Europe, and really and truly what a Renaissance is a change in time period. Notice that prefix there. And so a lot of things came out during this time that hadn't been acknowledged previously. And obviously with it talking specifically about African Americans, it's going to be information that's coming out from the African American community that hadn't been focused on before. So first of all, we have paintings. It says Jacob Lawrence was a painter who chronicled the experiences of the Great Migration through art. He was among the best-known 20th century art American painters. And here you see one of his paintings right there. Then we get into literature. Langston Hughes was a poet who blended his African-American cultural roots into his work. He wrote books, poetry, and drama, all combining experiences of African and American cultures. His way of blending jazz rhythms and dialects helped readers understand what the lives of African Americans in U.S. cities were like in the 1920s. And there is Mr. Langston Hughes. We have a critical thinking question down here. If you want to take this, if I'm not mistaken, it's probably a primary source. If you want to take this primary source from Langston Hughes and answer the questions, that will help you with your understanding. But for right now, let's go on into the next page. So then we have music. Music was a big thing that came out during the Harlem Renaissance. So if you look here, it says Duke Ellington was one of the most famous jazz musicians of the swing era. This pianist, composer, and band leader was one of the most important musicians of the 20th century. His band traveled all over the United States and Europe. Louis Armstrong was a master at playing the trumpet. You've probably heard of Louis Armstrong before. He was the first important solo performer to emerge in jazz music and is considered the most influential musician ever in jazz. Then we have a lady known as Bessie Smith. She was one of the most popular female blues singer of the 1920s and 30s and one of the greatest singers of her era. And there you have Miss Bessie Smith, Duke Ellington, and again with Louis Armstrong. So what I'm going to ask you to do, if you have access to it, I would like you to look up especially these three people, and listen to some of their music. Because yes, even though it was the 1920s and 1930s, we still have access to a lot of their music. So if you look that up on like YouTube or Google or something along those lines, you'll get to be able to hear some of the things that came out of the Harlem Renaissance. Also, if you wouldn't mind to do these questions again for understanding. You don't have to do the research it, but if you'll do these questions for the understanding just like we would if we were in class, I'd greatly appreciate it. Hopefully everyone is still doing well, and I will talk with you all later.